isn't any intervening cause. The question is a simple one. Was it foreseeable that the driver's failure to look, given the facts that the tracks were torn up, was it foreseeable that the driver's failure to look would lead to the injury? And I don't think you're going to have too much trouble arguing that it was foreseeable. The argument's going to go something like this. A railroad runs on tracks. When tracks are torn up, it's very likely that the railroad will be derailed. If a driver isn't looking, he won't see that the tracks are torn up. Given that the tracks were torn up, it is therefore foreseeable that the driver's failure to look would lead to this accident. Now, the legal cause question can come up in many, many different contexts, but I can almost promise you that whenever you have a proximate cause issue on an exam or a legal cause question on an exam, it's going to involve intervening causes. I said I can almost promise you. There's no guarantee on this. But most of the time, law school exams about proximate cause contain fact patterns that involve intervening causes. Here are some typical fact patterns. I negligently run you over and break your leg. You're lying in the roadway and somebody comes along and tries to rescue you. And in the course of rescuing you, he makes the injury to your leg worse. You want me to pay not only for the original broken leg, but for the worsened injury that resulted from the rescuer's negligence. Most of the time in a situation like that, courts say, rescuers are always around, and in the panic of an emergency, rescuers are likely to act in a manner that is less than reasonable, and therefore the rescuer's negligence is foreseeable, and Finns's conduct, which originally broke the leg, is a legal cause of the worsening of the broken leg. The same sort of argument is made about medical malpractice. I negligently break your leg, you're taken to the hospital, and a doctor in the hospital gives you the wrong medicine. And as a result, your eyes fall out. You don't just want me to pay for the broken leg, you want me to pay for your eyes falling out too. The question is whether my negligence, which was an actual cause of your broken leg, and incidentally was also an actual cause of your eyes falling out, because if I hadn't broken your leg, you never would have gotten that medicine. Whether my negligence, which was an actual cause of your eyes falling out, is also a legal cause of your eyes falling out. And most of the time the courts say it is foreseeable that a doctor who treats an accident victim will do so negligently. And therefore, the doctor's intervention is a concurring cause of harm, and the original wrongdoer is liable for whatever complications result. Now, I don't want you to get confused. I'm not saying the doctor isn't liable for those complications. The doctor might be liable for them too. And we're going to talk about what happens when two people proximately cause the same injury. We're going to talk about that in a minute. But what we're talking about here is the more difficult question of whether the original wrongdoer is liable for the complication. And of course, I'm not telling you what the answer is, because the answer doesn't matter as much as the argument that leads to the answer. But most of the time, what courts say in that kind of situation is that the practice of medicine is not a perfect art, and therefore it is foreseeable that doctors will act negligently when rendering treatment. So the doctor's intervening negligence is a concurring cause of harm, and Finns's conduct is still a legal cause of that complication. I like the way Dean Prosser put it a little better. He said, to say that bad surgery is not one of the risks that accompanies a broken leg is to pay an undue compliment to the medical profession. And that's not something you're going to hear a lot of lawyers doing, paying undue compliments to the medical profession. Another situation that shows up frequently in exam questions and in real life is intervention by a criminal act. Suppose, for example, that I run you over negligently and break your leg and you're lying in the roadway, and someone else sees you lying in the roadway with a broken leg and takes advantage of the situation by hitting you over the head with a baseball bat and stealing your wallet. Am I going to be liable for the injuries to your head that were caused by the baseball bat? Of course, it's something to argue about, and it might have to do with what part of town I broke your leg in. If you're lying in a horrible part of town where crime is a way of life or a fact of life, then it may be that a court will come to the conclusion that the criminal's intervention was foreseeable, and I am liable for the additional injuries caused by the criminal. But without special circumstances of that kind, courts usually say that the intervention of a criminal is unlikely, unforeseeable, improbable, extraordinary, because it's not something that happens very often in our society. And therefore, the intervention of a criminal is likely to be regarded as a superseding cause of harm, and I'm not going to be liable, probably, for the additional injuries caused by that criminal. Of course, there was no intervening cause of the broken leg. I'm still going to be liable for that broken leg. Well, we've talked about a few situations in which two or more people might be liable for the same injury. For example, in the case of the doctor that committed malpractice, I'm liable alone for your broken leg. The doctor didn't have anything to do with that. But the doctor and I might both be liable for your eyes falling out. When two or more people might be liable for the same injury, we refer to them as joint tortfeasors. Joint means together. Tortfeasors are people who commit a tort. So when two or more people are liable for the same injury, when two or more people have proximately caused the same injury by their liability-forming conduct, we call them joint tortfeasors. And in the majority of jurisdictions, joint tortfeasors are jointly and severally liable for the injury that they jointly caused. What that means is that regarding the eyes falling out, which I proximately caused and the doctor proximately caused, in the majority of jurisdictions, the doctor and I are jointly and severally liable, which means you can collect all your damages from me, or you can collect all your damages from the doctor, or you can collect all your damages from me and the doctor in any combination whatsoever. Joint means together, several means separate. Jointly and severally liable means liable jointly, that is liable together, and liable severally, that is liable separately. And that's the majority rule. In a minority, a small minority of jurisdictions, the joint and several liability rule has been replaced by an apportionment of fault rule. And in those minority jurisdictions, the jury must decide how much of the fault was mine, how much of the fault was the doctor's, in terms of percentages. And then I must pay my percent of the judgment, and the doctor must pay his or her percent of the judgment. That's the apportionment of fault rule. All right, we've talked about the basis of liability in a negligence case. We've talked about proximate cause in a negligence case. Let's talk about damages. And I'm going to say some things about damages that apply to cases other than negligence while we're on this subject. Here's an interesting piece of trivia that some lawyers don't even recognize. The word damage means harm or injury. The word damages means money that is paid to compensate for the harm or injury. The law of torts recognizes three forms of damages, three kinds of damages. First, nominal damages. Nominal means in name only. Nominal damages consist of a token sum, usually 6 cents or $1, that a jury awards to a plaintiff who has been the victim of a tort but who has sustained no actual injury. And I want to bring this to your attention. With only 4 exceptions, the definition of a tort includes the requirement of damage. That means that in most tort cases, nominal damages will not be available. If the jury concludes that there has been no injury, then there has been no tort. There are only 4 exceptions that are important enough for us to remember, and we have already studied those 4 exceptions. Can you remember what they are? They're 4 of the intentional torts. Battery, no requirement of damage. Now, a battery could involve harmful contact, which involves damage, but it could also involve offensive contact. An unwanted kiss on the cheek might be a battery, even though it results in no damage. Assault, once again, no damage is required. The plaintiff must experience apprehension, but it doesn't necessarily have to lead to actual damage. False imprisonment, if the plaintiff has been deprived of his liberty by being unlawfully confined, Even though no actual money damage has occurred, the plaintiff may be able to make out a false imprisonment case. Trespass to land damage is not required in a trespass to land case. In any one of those four cases, if the plaintiff proves that he or she was the victim of a tort, but the jury decides there was no actual damage, the jury may award nominal damages, 6 cents or $1, and of course the judge explains that to the jury at the trial. Another form of damages recognized by the law of torts is punitive damages. Punitive damages are damages that are awarded to the plaintiff for the purpose of punishing